When I look back now, I realize the signs were already there, scattered like crumbs on a path I didn't want to follow. At first, I brushed them off as nothing. Longer hours at work, a sudden interest in clothes she never used to wear, and the way she smiled at her phone with a brightness she hadn't directed at me in months. Little things. Things a husband notices but convinces himself are harmless. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for 9 years. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. Two people tied together by history, by the routines we'd built, by Sunday mornings when she liked to hum while cooking breakfast, and I pretended to read the newspaper but mostly watched her move. She had this ease about her, like the world bent toward her rhythm. I thought I was part of that rhythm. The cafeteria where she worked wasn't glamorous. It was just the food hall at the community college. Students came and went in an endless rush, trays clattering, voices filling the space with restless energy. Claire often complained about it when she came home, about how noisy it was, how the steam from the soup pots curled her hair, how her shoes smelled faintly of grease no matter how many times she scrubbed them. I listened, nodded, told her she deserved better. I had no idea she was finding better, right there among the clang of trays and the hiss of boiling water. It started innocently, at least from where I stood. She spoke about the new cook one evening. His name was Marco. She said it offhandedly while chopping onions for dinner. "Marco makes the best marinara," she said, almost to herself, before moving on to another subject. I barely registered it at the time. A week later, she mentioned him again, how he had grown up in Italy, how he'd taught her a trick to keep pasta from sticking. Her eyes glowed in a way I hadn't seen when she spoke about work before. I should have asked more questions then, but I didn't. I smiled, pretended to be interested, and went back to paying bills at the kitchen table. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It seeps in, quiet and unassuming, until one day you wake up and realize the ground under you has been slowly rotting away. Our intimacy had changed, too. Claire began to keep her distance at night, offering excuses about being tired, about early shifts, about stomach aches. When I did manage to pull her into my arms, she kissed me lightly, almost formally, like she was ticking a box rather than sinking into me. I told myself this was normal. Marriages had phases. People got tired. Work could drain anyone. I clung to those rationalizations because the alternative felt like staring into a black hole. Then came the evening that shifted everything. I had stopped by the college to bring her lunch, a small surprise on a Wednesday afternoon. I walked through the cafeteria, scanning the sea of tables for her familiar frame. The kitchen doors swung open, and that's when I saw it. Claire standing far too close to the man stirring a pot at the stove. His hair was dark and curled slightly at the ends, his hands broad and confident as he moved a spoon through the simmering sauce. She leaned in toward him, laughing, her hand brushing his arm in a way that looked far too practiced, far too comfortable. She didn't see me. I froze, my feet rooted to the linoleum floor, the sounds of students around me fading into static. The air seemed thick, unbreathable. My stomach twisted with a heat that was equal parts jealousy and fear. After a long minute, I turned and left without delivering the food I'd brought. That night, she came home cheerful, humming like she used to, as though the world was perfectly aligned. I sat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen, wondering if I'd imagined it all. Could a simple touch mean anything? Could laughter betray loyalty? My chest ached with the uncertainty. Over the next weeks, I became an unwilling detective in my own home. I noticed how she lingered at work, always with reasons that sounded rehearsed. I caught the faint scent of spices on her clothes, not the kind that lingered from the cafeteria's generic meals, but something deeper: garlic, basil, a warmth that spoke of dishes made with care. I began to dread the sound of her key in the door, unsure of what expression I'd see on her face: guilt, or worse, indifference. One evening, I tried to bring it up. I asked casually who she spent time with at work. She listed a few names, mostly women, before mentioning Marco again, her voice deliberately neutral. "He's just the cook," she said, her eyes flicking away from mine too quickly. That phrase, "just the cook," echoed in my head long after she went to bed. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the shadows of the ceiling fan cutting across the plaster like restless hands. Every memory of her recent behavior replayed in my mind. The late nights, the sudden smiles, the faint traces of someone else's presence clinging to her. By dawn, my pillow was damp with sweat, and I felt like a man bracing for a storm he could no longer ignore. The following Saturday, I told her I had errands and drove instead to the college. The cafeteria was quieter on weekends, but Marco was there. Through the small window in the kitchen door, I saw him again, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, flour dusting his arms, his movements fluid as he kneaded dough. My stomach clenched, and then Claire walked in. She wasn't supposed to be working that day. At least, that's what she had told me. She carried no uniform, only a casual dress I recognized from our date nights. She looked radiant, her hair loose around her shoulders, her lips parted in a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. She approached Marco, and he greeted her with a look that needed no translation, familiar, intimate, as if they had already crossed a line that could not be undone. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned against the counter, the way he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, it was enough. My hands tightened on the steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. I drove away before either of them saw me, the world outside my windshield blurring into streaks of gray. At home, I sat in silence, the house pressing in on me with its emptiness. The walls seemed to echo with her laughter, but it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to someone else. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own life, watching from the outside as everything I thought was solid began to fracture. That night, Claire slipped into bed beside me, smelling faintly of flour and something sweet, like fresh bread. She kissed my cheek and whispered goodnight as if nothing were wrong. My body went rigid. I couldn't bring myself to answer. And in that silence, as the ceiling fan turned above us and she drifted into sleep, I knew the truth. Something had already shifted between us. I could feel it in the weight of her body beside mine, present but distant, like a shadow that no longer belonged to me. Still, I needed proof. Not whispers of suspicion, not fleeting glimpses. I needed something undeniable, the kind of truth that would rip apart every excuse she might offer. So I began to plan. I told myself a lie to begin the plan, that proof would make the pain behave, that if I could frame it, label it, date stamp it, I might manage the ache the way a museum handles a dangerous artifact, behind glass, gloved, classified. So I treated my marriage like a case file. I started with a notebook, the thin kind with a cardboard cover, and mapped out her shifts the way fishermen chart tides. The cafeteria posted schedules every Sunday night online. She always claimed the early morning, but the grid told a different story, closing shifts blooming like bruises across Thursdays and Fridays. I circled them in red and felt, for a second, like I'd accomplished something, though all I'd done was confirm a feeling I was already drowning in. I learned the rhythm of the building, too. At dawn, the college parking lots were a mild hush, gulls arguing over crusts, leaves skating along the asphalt. By noon, the place rose in a clatter, vending machines coughing change, the heavy whump of the kitchen door, the metronome tick of trays bumping each other. The cafeteria smelled like its own weather, steam and tomato and coffee grounds, a bright citrus note from a bottle of cleaner. I sat in my car and let those scents drift through the cracked window, trying to become invisible to myself, to them, to the pity I imagined in strangers' eyes. When the delivery trucks came, I watched. When the smokers stepped out to the loading dock for a minute of stolen air, I watched. On the third Thursday, the sky sagged into rain, and the concrete shone like a mirror. Claire exited the service door with Marco. No uniforms, just kitchen blacks and a white apron streaked with color. He held an umbrella. She tucked herself to his side as though the world had narrowed into a small circle only big enough for two. She tipped her head back and laughed at something he said, and then her hand, my wife's steady, capable hand, rested against his wrist as if that were the most natural place it had ever belonged. They stood like that. Not long, but long enough for me to feel the timeline of our marriage combed through me, strand by strand, and find the knots. I didn't take a picture. I wanted to, but my fingers shook and, coward that I was, I still craved a version of us that could be rescued by doubt. So I watched them disappear into the door again, a rectangle of light swallowing them whole. At home, I tried gentleness, the kind that has saved us before. I cooked her favorite soup, roasted red pepper with a swirl of cream, and when she came through the door, I ladled it into a bowl and slid it across the counter. She smiled. It was the smile she kept for polite strangers, light and correct, with no weight behind it. I asked about her day, and she told me stories about students, about the vending machine eating someone's dollar, about a coffee grinder that gave up its ghost. She was a river of harmless details. Not once did she say his name. After she went to shower, I stood alone at the sink and held my breath until my scalp tingled, proving it meant going inside. I told myself I was returning a tray, an old one I had mysteriously acquired, a thrift store rescue. Whatever excuse would keep my conscience from calling me a trespasser. I arrived late afternoon on a Saturday, a gray day that made the building's fluorescence look unhealthy. A student worker at the front counter waved me through when I pointed toward the kitchen with a helpless shrug. "Back there," he said, already turning to someone else. My heart knocked so loudly that the metal bowls on the shelf seemed to vibrate in sympathy. The kitchen was a geography of fire and chill. Steam rose from a stockpot like a ghost trying to remember its name. The walk-in hummed, cold breath leaking around its seal. And there, with his back to me, stood Marco. He moved with unhurried certainty, measuring flour by feel, a small constellation of white across the front of his apron. I set the tray on a rack as quietly as I could and pivoted toward the corridor that led to dry storage. The hall felt like the inside of a throat, narrow, lined with pipes, warm from the heat of nearby machines. I found a shadowed angle behind a pallet of canned tomatoes, crouched, and tried to still every part of myself that wanted to tremble. Memories arrived uninvited, the way distant thunder offers its own commentary. Claire at 26, standing in our first apartment in socks and my shirt, burning a sauce she'd sworn she could make from memory. Claire at 30, holding my hand in a hospital waiting room when my father's heart misfired, her palm warm like a promise. Claire last spring, asleep on the couch after a long week, her breath soft, the dog curled at her feet. The mind is cruel. It does not file things chronologically. It collages everything you cannot bear to lose and presses it against everything you may already have. A bell rang somewhere, a kitchen timer, maybe, and then voices, faint and bright. I slipped my phone into my pocket and clicked it on silent, a superstitious gesture that felt like pocketing a rosary. I could see only slivers through the gap in the stacked boxes, but I caught the outline of her dress first, a navy blue I knew well, a dress she wore on the nights we used to call ours. She looked different in this light, sharpened somehow, edges gleaming. Marco leaned in, saying something I could not hear, his hand hovering near her hip as if completing an electric circuit. My chest seemed to forget its own mechanics. I had the strange urge to cough, to reinsert myself into the scene as a person and not a ghost. I took pictures then, crooked, indistinct. Hands, the curve of a shoulder, the arch of her neck as she tipped her head and laughed. It felt like a betrayal all over again, the camera cold in my grip as if it disagreed with my purpose. I hated the impulse to document. I hated the need. But I kept going until my screen filled with small mosaics of what was happening to me. Days blunted into each other after that. I went to work and sat at my desk, performed the movements of my job like a mime doing an imitation of a man. At night, I collected new variations of silence. The one at dinner, where utensils made small, informative noises. The one in the living room, where the television tried to persuade us we were normal. The one in bed, a cold plateau where we lay parallel and distant as separate horizons. I began to understand that proof wasn't meant to tame pain. It was meant to remove the deniability that keeps you standing. Once it's gone, you have to decide whether you're going to fall. She left her notebook on the counter one evening, a spiral-bound thing with grocery lists and doodled flowers. Between a sketch of basil leaves and a scribbled reminder to buy dish soap was a line that did not concern groceries at all. Close Monday. Deep clean. Stay late. It felt like an invitation I had not been meant to see. Or maybe I was already inventing patterns in the tea leaves of my home. Either way, a plan suggested itself with the steadiness of a tide coming in. I returned Monday at dusk, dressed in the kind of anonymity you wear when you don't want to be remembered. Plain jacket, cap, shoes that made little sound. The cafeteria had closed to students. Chairs were tipped on tables like a city under curfew. Through the window in the kitchen door, I watched workers finish up, spraying down stainless steel, wrapping pans in film, counting boxes. One by one they trickled out the back, jackets shrugged on, shoes squeaking, the tired relief of a shift completed. The last two shapes still moving were the ones I feared and expected. When the service door clanged shut behind the others, the building settled into a hush broken only by the hush of ventilation and the occasional distant tick of cooling metal. I slipped inside when the final cart squealed past the corridor, hugging the wall as though I could become it. The kitchen light flattened everything into a surgical clarity. I moved behind the racks as if crossing a river on stones. The walk-in stood to my left like a monument to a colder world. I tested its handle, and the door gave, swallowing me into frost. I hadn't planned to hide there, but the cold felt clean, almost moral. My breath fogged before my face. My fingers bit with the first sting of numbness. I crouched behind a stack of butter boxes and told my chattering teeth to behave. Outside, footsteps, a soft scuff, then the murmurous hush of two people speaking close. The sound of cloth, the glide of a drawer, the click of a burner. A low song played from someone's phone, something with a lilt that made me think of open windows and late summer. Time changed shape. Minutes elongated, then vanished. I couldn't tell if the cold was slowing everything or if adrenaline had wound the clock so tight it hummed. The handle moved. A slice of warm, lit air cut into the blue dim. I held myself absolutely still as the door opened a foot and a hand reached in for a pan of berries. The wrist was hers. I knew the small pale scar near the bone from when a cabinet door had nipped her last Christmas. She took the pan, and the door eased shut, leaving me with the sound of my own blood like surf in my ears. I eased the door open a hair, enough to frame the world with a pale rim of light. Through that narrow border I saw them. Claire leaned against the prep table, her hair gathered high, a few strands falling, the tendons of her throat a clean line. Marco stood close enough that their shadows merged on the floor. He wiped his hands and looked at her as though tasting something in his mind. She reached up, touched the corner of his mouth with her thumb, a gesture so tender it felt ceremonial. I lifted my phone, hands burning with cold and purpose, and took a photo that did not need translation. A ladle slipped somewhere, a bright, traitorous clang. Claire's head turned toward the walk-in, her eyes narrowing as though the air itself had just whispered. She straightened, alert, a deer hearing a twig crack. Marco followed her gaze, shoulders tensing, a question forming in the way his fingers curled. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded once, not speaking. I pressed back into the frozen dark, heart battering the cold like a bird in a chimney. The handle to the walk-in twitched again, a curious little rattle, and then began to turn. The rectangle of light widened, spilling across my shoes, across the fat silver pipes, across the boxes stacked around me. I lifted the phone despite the tremor in my hands. The door swung fully open, and their silhouettes filled the frame. The light from the kitchen spilled across the floor in a wide band, catching me as though I were a trespasser in my own life. Claire's silhouette framed the doorway, her hand still resting on the handle, Marco looming just behind her with that unhurried, unbothered posture of his. For a second, none of us moved. My phone, still raised, glinted in the fluorescent wash, and Claire's eyes locked onto it like a hawk spotting prey. A whole conversation passed between us without words, the knowledge of what I had seen, the undeniable truth now captured in my trembling hands. "Jake?" Her voice cracked like glass under pressure. Not angry, not even apologetic. Just startled, caught mid-step between one life and the next. I should have said something then, anything that might have anchored me to myself. But all I could hear was the roar of my pulse, the dull thud of blood in my ears. My body screamed to flee and confront all at once, leaving me stuck in the paralysis of someone watching a train bear down on them with no strength to move. Marco's gaze shifted from me to her, back again, measuring, assessing. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look surprised. He looked like a man who had expected this moment to arrive sooner or later and was merely curious to see which way the current would pull. "I can explain," Claire whispered, stepping closer, her arms folded as if she needed to hold herself together. I wanted to laugh. Explain? What could explanation do in the face of images burned into my brain like acid etching on glass? The photos on my phone weren't evidence anymore. They were scars already carved into me. I backed deeper into the cold box of the walk-in, the frost stinging my lungs with every breath. The chill gnawed at my bones, but I welcomed it. It was honest. It was real, unlike the lies that had wrapped themselves around my marriage. Marco broke the silence first. Maybe we should. I cut him off with a look. My stare was enough to strip the sentence from his tongue. He raised his hands, palms outward, a gesture that wasn't quite surrender, but close enough. Claire moved toward me, hesitant, like approaching a wounded animal. Jake, please. This isn't what you think. The old cliché, and it almost broke me, because it was exactly what I thought. Every small suspicion, every late night, every new dress explained itself in that moment with brutal clarity. My throat tightened. How long? The words scraped out of me, ragged, raw. Her lips parted, closed again. A beat of silence. And then, a few months. The sound that came out of me didn't feel human. It was low, half growl, half laugh, like my body couldn't decide whether to collapse or fight. Marco shifted, perhaps preparing for me to launch at him, but I stayed rooted in place. My fury had frozen, solid as the ice walls around us. Claire reached out, fingers trembling, but stopped short of touching me. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, Jake. It just what? My voice cracked like a whip. Just happened? Like tripping on the sidewalk. Like misplacing your keys? Her eyes filled with tears, and for an instant, I saw the woman I had loved for 9 years, the woman who used to hum over breakfast, who used to kiss me with warmth instead of obligation. That memory hurt worse than any betrayal. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry. The word ricocheted through me until it became meaningless noise. Sorry was for forgetting to pick up milk, for missing a call. Not for breaking vows. Not for handing the most intimate part of yourself to someone else while I sat at home waiting for a life that no longer existed. Marco's voice came then, deep and steady. Maybe it's better if I go. But I couldn't let him leave. Not yet. My fury needed a shape, and he was the easiest target. You stay. I snapped, pointing at him with the hand still clutching my phone. You don't get to walk away like this never happened. He stilled, jaw tightening, but he didn't argue. Perhaps he thought his composure would shield him. To me, it only proved how practiced he was at this. How many times he'd stood in someone else's shadow without flinching. Claire's tears spilled then, sliding down her cheeks, glistening under the harsh kitchen light. Jake, please, can we just go home and talk? Not here. Home. The word twisted in me, because suddenly I wasn't sure what home was anymore. The house we shared felt contaminated, walls steeped in her secrets. Our bed, nothing more than an artifact of a life I could never crawl back into. My hand lowered. The phone felt heavy, poisonous, but I couldn't release it. I stepped out of the walk-in, brushing past her so close I could smell the faint mix of flour and perfume clinging to her dress. It was the scent of betrayal, burned into my senses. I didn't yell. I didn't strike. The rage was there, seething, but beneath it was something far worse. Emptiness. Like someone had scooped me hollow and left only the echo of what I had been. I walked past them, down the corridor, through the cafeteria that now seemed cavernous in its silence. Each step rang too loud, too final. Behind me, I heard Claire call my name once, twice, her voice breaking. Marco said nothing. Outside, the night air slammed into me with a damp chill, and I sucked it in like a drowning man breaching the surface. My car sat waiting under the lone lamp, an island of light in the dark lot. I unlocked it with numb fingers and slid inside, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping me tethered to the world. I didn't drive. I sat there, headlights off, staring at the empty stretch of asphalt ahead. My reflection in the windshield looked like a stranger's, hollow-eyed, slack-jawed, a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The phone buzzed. A message from Claire. Please, don't leave like this. We need to talk. I powered it off. Silence filled the car, deep and absolute. But silence isn't peace. It's a drumbeat of questions, pounding until they blur together. What now? Who am I without her? What's left of me after trust has been carved out? Somewhere in the distance, the cafeteria doors opened, and 2 figures stepped into the night. I didn't wait to see who they were. My engine roared to life, and I pulled away, leaving the building and the wreckage of my marriage shrinking in the rearview mirror. Yet even as the road stretched out before me, one thought rooted itself deep and unshakable. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Something darker was pulling me forward, demanding resolution, and I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. I drove until the map of our town dissolved into a necklace of quiet streets and low-lit porches. The night felt hollowed out, like a seashell humming with lost tides. I pulled into the overlook above the river and let the engine tick itself cool. Down below, water folded around dark stones, unbothered by the calamity unfolding in a car on the hill. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and tried to breathe my way back into my own body. It didn't work. The images were everywhere, her hand on his wrist, the light on her face, a tenderness I recognized too well offered to a stranger. The phone sat in my lap like a captured animal. Proof. The word had sounded noble in my head when I'd begun to hunt it, like I was after something medicinal. Now it felt like a blade I'd left in my pocket too long, cutting me each time I moved. I didn't throw it into the river. I didn't smash it on the guardrail. I placed it carefully in the glove box, as if what it held could be made harmless by ordinary gestures. I went home near dawn. The sky was a soft bruise over the roofs, and the sparrows had begun to stitch their small songs into the day. In the kitchen, the basil on the windowsill leaned toward the light. The house smelled faintly of last night's soup, a ghost of comfort clinging to the air. I slept an hour on the couch and woke to the sound of the front door. Claire entered with the careful shoulders of someone stepping onto thin ice. She stood in the doorway to the living room, hands cupped around a mug she hadn't brought to her lips. "I'm moving out," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "Please, let's try counseling," she said, one step forward, then back. "Counseling can't rewrite what already happened," I said. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the words seemed to fall to the floor between us like dropped keys no one could bend to pick up. For lines. For small bridges that could not hold us. After that, we spoke in logistics, the language people use when the heart has threatened to abandon them altogether. We listed which drawers held which lives. The dog, Daisy, followed us from room to room, her nails soft on the wood, eyes bright with a question I couldn't answer. The first box I packed was the quiet one. Documents, spare chargers, a book my father had once underlined almost to death. The second was small, but harder. Photos of us that would not pass easily into any new home. I didn't tear them. I didn't frame them. I slipped them into an envelope like someone laying a note in a church offering plate, hoping for something I could not name. Claire moved carefully, as if each motion might wake an injury we hadn't yet touched. She didn't reach for me. She didn't try to hold my hand or pull the words back into her mouth. When she folded a sweater, it looked like prayer. We set an appointment with an attorney, two actually, one for her and one for me, because fairness mattered even when fairness hurt. The week unfurled in the small tasks of ending a life. Forwarding mail, unlocking that bank account we'd meant to consolidate and never did, calling the landlord of an apartment above a bakery that smelled every morning like warm rescue. At the courthouse, a clerk slid papers beneath glass and stamped the date in red. I watched the ink bloom and felt oddly grateful for its decisiveness. A date is a plank you can step onto when the floor is still uncertain. Daisy was the tenderest negotiation. The house would stay with Claire. Her shifts were erratic, but the dog knew these rooms, and I could picture Daisy waiting at the front window without my chest collapsing. We promised long walks together on neutral ground by the river. I promised to pick her up on Saturdays for the woods. It was a small mercy to give the creature who had loved us without conditions. I avoided the college. I avoided the grocery aisle with basil and the pasta we had sworn we'd make together every week and then forgot. But avoidance is a thin blanket. The cold finds its way through the seams. On the third Sunday in my new place, I woke to the bakery's hum below and the warm drift of sugar in the air. I lay still and listened to the pans ring and the ovens sigh. The scent of flour, once a trigger, arrived differently now. The day widened. I got up and walked to the farmer's market. I bought tomatoes so red they looked like they were holding their breath. I bought garlic. I bought basil, because naming the thing makes it less able to own you. That afternoon, I cooked alone for the first time in months. The knife was steady in my hand. Olive oil whispered to the pan. Garlic released its sudden sweetness, and I stirred until the edge came off. The sauce simmered, patient as a heartbeat. I didn't pretend I wasn't thinking of him, of how he had shown her the trick. I learned it anyway, not to honor their memory, but to take back a room I had abandoned. When I ate, I did it at the small table by the window, a lemon cutting board beneath the bowl, the fork warm against my palm. I didn't cry. I didn't toast to anything. I ate slowly and let my mouth tell my mind that pleasure was still a thing the world allowed. I found a therapist whose office was painted the color of early corn. She didn't ask me to retell everything at once. We moved like divers learning the temperature of the water. Some sessions were only breath and the precise naming of a sensation, a tightness behind the sternum, a spark of anger in the tongue. We made a strange inventory: rage, grief, relief, the dullness of afternoons, the sudden brightness of a morning with no messages to dread. She taught me to ask a different question than why did she do it? We asked, instead, what part of me needs my own steady attention now? It was a question that changed where my gaze fell. I kept the photos for the legal process, and when the process was complete, when the papers came back with stamps enough to persuade even the most reluctant part of the past to stop claiming me, I sat at the table with the envelope and slid the images out. I expected an earthquake and got a weather shift instead, a cold breeze moving across an old pond. I took a deep breath and fed them one by one into a small shredder I'd bought for the usual junk mail. The machine hummed as if this were any other task. Strips gathered in the bin like white ribbon. It felt less like erasing and more like composting. Someday, I thought, this will make the soil of something new. Marco did not remain a faceless figure in my mind for long. A month into my apartment life, I returned to the campus at dusk to audit a night course in photography. It wasn't a punishment, it was a retooling. I wanted the camera to be a way I saw beauty again instead of a way I proved harm. On my way to class, I passed the cafeteria windows. The room inside was bright and empty, chairs inverted on tables like quiet ships. I expected him in his narrow empire of steel and flame. He wasn't there. A younger guy walked the line, his posture new to the choreography of the place. I stood for a moment with my palm flat on the cool glass and allowed the absence to register. Later, through a colleague of Claire's, I heard that he had taken another job across town, closer to his mother. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was a mercy people invented for me. Either way, it placed him on a different map, and that was enough. Claire and I had 2 final conversations in the months that followed, both short, both soft around the edges. We met by the river where the path widens around a stand of alder trees. She looked thinner, or maybe it was the way grief rearranged her posture. She did not ask for reversal. I did not offer punishment. We spoke of practical things, then of Daisy, then of the strange ways time both sprinted and stalled. When we parted, she pressed a small envelope into my hand. Inside was a recipe card, her handwriting neat and deliberate. The marinara with her corrections in the margins, and below it, in parentheses, a note about the first winter in our first apartment and the way the heat clanged at night like a radiator exorcising old ghosts. I held the card as if it were a truce flag from a country I no longer lived in. Summer came on like a forgiveness. The bakery doors were propped open each morning, and the city woke with a sugar sigh. I ran in the cool before sunrise and returned with my shirt damp and my lungs open. On Tuesdays, I walked Daisy along the river and let her choose our route. She always chose the long one. On Thursdays, I stood in a dark room and watched a landscape swim up from white paper, blacks pooling, grays learning the exact words they wanted to say. The first time an image waited in the tray and became itself, I felt something align inside me, a click I had been missing since the night I hid behind canned tomatoes and frost. One evening I stopped outside the cafeteria on my way home, not to haunt the past, but to test the air. Through the glass, students piled plates with ordinary hunger and ordinary hurry. A new cook lifted a pan, and steam rose and turned the light into a veil. The room looked like any room where people feed themselves and talk about exams and weekend plans. Nothing in it belonged to me, and for the first time, that fact did not carve me open. I walked away. The divorce decree arrived by certified mail that Friday. The envelope was heavier than its size suggested, like a book filled with names. I signed where I was told, initialed where the arrows asked, and slid the pages back into their sleeve. At the post office, the clerk stamped the corner with a sound both final and merciful. When I stepped outside, the sky was the particular blue of dishes drying on a rack. I stood on the sidewalk and let the sun hold my face for a long moment. That night, I cooked again. This time I added olives and a small pinch of sugar, not because a cook had taught me or a memory demanded it, but because the sauce asked for it as it thickened, and I knew how to listen. I ate at the window, the city's evening settling like a shawl, and when I finished, I took Daisy for a walk along the dark ribbon of the river. The water took the moon and broke it into 1,000 friendly pieces. A heron lifted from the reeds, slow and certain, and moved toward the far bank without looking back. Later, in the quiet, I opened the photo portfolio from class, the one not built on proving pain but on noticing. A child chasing bubbles. A telephone pole with decades of staples holding nobody's posters. The bakery window fogged with stories I would never be told. I slid the last print into its sleeve and closed the cover. In the space the old images had occupied, a new archive had begun to gather, small, attentive, mine. I turned out the kitchen light and stood in the doorway long enough to recognize my own house by the shape of its hush. On the counter, the basil leaned toward the window as if it knew morning would be kind. The phone in the drawer was heavy, but no longer sovereign. The ring I had worn for 9 years lay in a small dish by the sink, not banished, just tenderly retired. I wasn't healed in any grand, cinematic way. The ache still moved through me like weather across a field. But the forecast had changed. There were openings in the clouds where light could practice its trade. When I finally went to bed, the fan traced its soft ellipses on the ceiling, and the apartment breathed with the contentment of clean sheets. If the past knocked, it did so with gentler knuckles. I closed my eyes and pictured the river, and the heron, and a kitchen that belonged to me, where the sauce would simmer as long as I asked it to, and nowhere in the building would a door swing open without my consent. In the morning, I would run, and then I would bring Daisy to the water, and then I would stand in a dark room and coax light from darkness until it told me something true. Outside, a train passed, low and steady, and the city answered with a soft, ordinary hum. I let it carry me forward,